Hey everybody, this is John for Nexus MTG, starting out with our burn month. So, what is burn? Why should you play it? Etc. etc. This is kind of an explanation for newer players and players that don't necessarily play aggressive decks. So, those of you that are newer to Magic, this is probably a little bit more aimed towards you. But, it's a general overview for those that don't normally play aggressive decks and kind of an explanation of what the deck does, what it's trying to do, how it accomplishes that, and kind of a general overview of what explains what people say what is a burn deck. So, burn is an aggressive deck. Aggressive decks try to get their opponent from 20 to 0 as quickly as possible. It's primarily red based as opposed to some other decks that are green, white, black, or blue based. So it's primarily a red based deck. Big notes for this particular archetype. Usually noted with quick 1 and 2 drop creatures that either have things like haste or some type of enter the battlefield ability to deal damage or interact with your opponent. Things like Goblin Guide, Monastery Swiftspear, Eidolon of the Great Revel for the Eternal formats. Things like Gitu Lava Runner. The Yoshino Pyromancer, those kind of things in the current standard format. This is circa April of 2019, so use that as your gauge. And then frequently uses efficient direct damage spells in standard, things like Shock, Lightning Strike, those kind of effects. Wizard Lightning, things that can go to your opponent's face as well as target creatures and planeswalkers. In Eternal formats, you're talking about the staple Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, Price of Progress, various different things depending on the format. So examples of the decks in Standard, the current one, you have Fanatical Firebrand and Gitu Lava Runner as 1-mana creatures. Fanatical Firebrand is a 1/1 with haste, can also sack it to deal 1 damage to any target. Gitu Lava Runner is a 1/2, the one you have 2 spells in your graveyard. It becomes a 2/2 with haste, so if you play this on like turn 2 or turn 3 after you've played like a Shock, and play a Wizard's Lightning after you play it, can attack on turn 2 with haste, which is pretty critical. You have Vioshia Pyromancer, which attacks things or does 2 damage to a player or planeswalker when it comes to play. Goblin Chainwhirler has an ETB trigger. And then you have Runaway Steamkin to kind of power out the experimental frenzies, lay up the stage to draw some cards. And then beyond that, you have a bunch of direct damage spells: Shock, Lightning Strike, Wizard's Lightning. 1 copy of Banefire. So this deck is a little more creature heavy than most traditional burn lists, but is basically trying to do the most efficient things with creatures and spells, which is a hallmark of the burn decks. Modern burn, a little bit more spell heavy. You have Monastery Swiftspear and Goblin Guide, both creatures that have haste. Swiftspear gets +1/+1 for each spell you play that turn, as far as non-creature spells. Goblin Guide is a 2/2 every turn, has a downside of revealing the top card of your opponent's library. And then Eidolon of the Great Revel. Basically, each player is taking damage for anything they cast 3 or less. And since you're trying to be the aggressive deck, you're trying to shorten the game, and that this usually is able to be worked to your advantage. Then you have a bunch of other direct damage spells or spells that can target creatures. Things like Lightning Bolt, Lava Spike. Searing Blaze can hit a creature and a player at the same time. Boros Charm can deal 4 damage to a player. Lightning Helix with a little bit of life gain attached to it. Skewer the Critics, Rift the Bolt. So, just examples of efficient spells. You're only running 19 to 20 lands in a lot of these decks. Standard deck tends to run a little bit more because it's running Experimental Frenzy. And then finally you have Legacy. Much of the same spells you will see in the modern burn lists. You're running the same creature suite usually. You're playing more powerful spells like Price of Progress, which basically deals damage equal to the number of non-basic lands a player controls. So in a format like Legacy, there's a lot of those decks running around. Then you also have access to Chain Lightning and Fire Blast. Chain Lightning is basically a sorcery speed Lightning Bolt, and Fire Blast is a 6-mana thing, but you can also sack 2 mountains instead, and it deals 4 damage to any target. So, all depends on what the format has available to it, which cards you're going to end up playing, but most of these decks are playing efficient red creatures, efficient direct damage spells, and then the kind of the suite of utility cards around them is decided by whatever splash color they're running or whatever the format has. Like, for instance, in Legacy, there's a lot of graveyard-based combo decks. So you have Fairy Macabre and Tormod's Crypt. Your free graveyard interaction spells that can come down early. Pyrostack Pillar pairs with Eidolon and the Great Revel to help deal with spell-based decks, etc. So, why should you play it? First off, it's fast gameplay with a few very important decisions, so if you're not someone who likes to sit and grind for 20, 30, 40 minutes rounds or more, games frequently only last 4 to 6 turns depending on the format. Obviously, the more eternal formats like Legacy and Modern, the games tend to go a little bit faster. And then the decisions that are usually important are the sequencing and maximizing your damage are usually key. Sometimes you have to play around life gain, those kind of things. But for the most part, most people would consider it a fairly easy deck to pick up, and the trick is learning what hands you mulligan and those kind of things. So it's a little bit easier to understand and pick up burn than it is a lot of other decks. Not saying it doesn't have important decisions, just saying there tends to be fewer important decisions than most other decks have. And then another thing is attacks on multiple axes, whereas most aggressive decks are primarily creature based. Some might have a few planeswalkers in it. This deck attacks on the axis of it has efficient creatures and has a lot of spells that can target your opponent directly, so your opponent has to be able to deal with both your creatures and your spells before you kill them. What are its issues? So one of its big advantages that I haven't mentioned in other slides is that it has large amounts of redundancy. A lot of your cards do the same thing. But what that means is you need a critical mass of spells as opposed to a 1 or 2 card, what they call a combo. So mulligans are hugely negative. With cards being redundant, you need more quantity than quality. If you're just looking at usually from a spell-based thing, you usually need 6 to 7 spells to kill your opponent. So the fewer cards you're operating with, the worse it is. Life gain. So a lot of life gain is minimum 3 or 4, depending on what the thing does. Like currently in Standard, you have cards like Absorb or Moment of Craving that tack on 2 or 3 life, and a lot of times those are just a card plus for those particular players playing those cards. But life gain in and of itself is not enough, because eventually the burn deck will draw enough burn and will overwhelm that. You need to be pressuring them in addition to gaining some life and offsetting the life loss. One of the other bigger problems for burn decks is bigger creatures. Red spells, with the exception of things like Lava Coil, Flame Slash, and some other things, often have problems killing creatures. The sweet spot's usually 4 toughness. So anything with 4 or 5 toughness can require multiple spells for the red deck to kill. And then obviously larger creatures can blank your other creatures. Like think about in Modern, a card like Tarmogoyf can blank a Monastery Swiftspear, a Goblin Guide, or an Eidolon. In Standard, some of the things like Tempest Jin or any of the various things like Lyra, Shalai. Any of those bigger creatures can frequently blank your 2 and 3 powered creatures into attacking into them. Obviously, like Goblin Chain Whirler has the advantage of first strike, so that makes combat a little bit more tricky for your opponent. But generally speaking, the bigger creatures can kind of blank what you have going on. We'll get into further discussions about how to utilize creatures, how to utilize spells in further videos, but I just wanted to give you kind of a quick rundown of what burn decks are, what they kind of look like throughout the various formats, Standard, Modern, Legacy. We might get into some Pauper this month, depending on how far we're able to go in depth this month. But for this month, for Nexus MTG, we're going to be covering burn decks in all relevant formats. This has been Dusk, or Dusk, no longer for Dust Till Dawn Gaming. It's now MTG Nexus. Thanks for hanging out.